Hello, hello, Eureka Whiskey Club members. Welcome to our August virtual tasting. As always, Trevor coming to you from my home bar, and happy to be home. Last time I was doing this on the road, so happy to be back. Really excited about this month's picks. We have our Buffalo Trace single barrel pick and our Eagle Rare single barrel pick. Kind of already put a healthy dent into both of these. But they are delicious, so we'll get into all that. Really happy to have a return guest tonight, and we'll introduce Danny here in a second. If you weren't on a few months ago when we had Danny, he's a wealth of knowledge, so really excited to welcome Danny back. Really quick, just some upcoming announcements for the club. Next month we do have some exciting special releases coming out. I'm excited to announce we have the first single barrel Bardstown rye ever to hit the state of California, coming out next month. So we're going to have 2 barrels coming out. I think each restaurant should receive about 12 to 18 of those picks. So definitely limited. Those Bardstown rye picks are going to be available to all active members in the month of September. We're also going to be releasing a Blanton's Gold barrel, which we're really excited about. That's going to be exclusive to tenured members. We haven't determined yet if it's going to be 1 year or 2 year to start off the bat. One being in the club 1 year or longer, 2 years or longer, but we'll announce that. But both of those barrels are slated to be released sometime next month. So just pay attention to your emails, and we're excited to get those into your hands. And then in October, we have a special release of our Four Roses single barrel pick. So that will be it won't be the featured whiskey of the month, but that will be available, and TBD on if that's going to be a 10-year pick or not. But some special stuff coming up. So Bardstown Rye, first single barrels to hit the state of California of the Bardstown Rye, Blanton's Gold, and then we got a cool Four Roses pick coming up in October. So I'm going to introduce you to Danny in a second. We got some cool prizes to give away tonight. So if you are joining us from Facebook or YouTube, just remember to check that you're under the account associated with your membership when you're asking your questions, so we can hopefully get those asked. And if you are joining us live from Instagram, welcome. We can't filter questions in from Instagram, so if you are a member watching on Instagram, hop over to Facebook or YouTube. But if you're just joining us from Instagram and you're not familiar with the club, welcome. This is Eureka Whiskey Club. It's a subscription-based program that we offer at our restaurants. You can go to our website and find out more information about it. So first place prize tonight for the top questions, we have a Buffalo Trace coffee table book, a Buffalo Trace hat, a koozie, and a really cool tote bag, so kind of like a swag bag package. And then second place is also a swag package. We're going to have some bar items. We're going to have a Buffalo Trace spoon, a jigger, a muddler, some playing cards, and also a tote bag. So some cool wearable, usable swag to give away tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Danny Kahn, who's the Master Distiller and Aging Operations Director at Buffalo Trace. So Danny, tell us who you are, tell us what you do, and we'll start getting into talking about all things Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, and I have some curveballs for you, I think, tonight, because you were on a few months ago. And I think I took it easy on you. So I'm going to give you the hard-hitting questions tonight.
Bring it on, and hopefully it will be flavor and technical in nature, because that I'm not worried about. Well, hello, everybody from Eureka. Happy to be here. You guys are all very fortunate to get a single barrel of Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. I don't even get those very often, but I do get a chance to taste them a little bit. So a little bit of an introduction. This speaking type stuff is not my day job. My title, as indicated, was Master Distiller, Distillation Aging Operations Director. I've been with Sazerac for 6.5 years. The first 4.5 as Master Distiller of Barton 1792. And the last 2 years, 2.5-ish years, as the Master Distiller, Distillation Aging Operations Director, where I oversee Buffalo Trace, Barton 1792, our distillery in Canada, and a little bit of involvement in our India operations. So my background is technical. It's alcohol production. Prior to making whiskey. I made beer for a couple of notable breweries for about 30 years. And prior to that, which got me into this whole world, is I made beer as a hobby. And I suppose statute of limitations apply. But as a sophomore in college, I might have shared this story. I don't recall, but it is a true story. I started out as a chemical engineer, and my best friend's fake ID was confiscated. And although he did not go to jail, it was taken away, and he was given a court date, and he was terrified. And my reaction was, we have to learn how to make beer. So there was a homebrew shop in Davis, and that began my adventure. I started making beer and found out that Davis actually had winemaking and beer science. And as they say, the rest is history. So happy to be here. Love questions, and bring them on. And otherwise, I'm just going to ramble. And Trevor, hopefully you'll put up some guardrails to keep me in line.
Hey, the floor is yours. You can ramble as much as you want.
Yeah, and I enjoy talking about how flavor is created. How we make flavor, how I get to pull levers to create different flavors, and in general, what is bourbon? How do we make it, and all that kind of stuff. So bring on your challenging questions.
Awesome. All right, I guess I'm getting roasted in the comment section right now because I thought I said muddler, which is a tool which I can like muddler, but maybe I said muggler, but definitely thought I said muddler. So let's talk about, just starting off, let's just talk a little bit about the history of Buffalo Trace. Obviously, I think I'd hope that the majority of our members are familiar with the distillery. I always tell people, people always ask me, I'm going to Kentucky, what should I do? And I say, I don't care what you do, go to Buffalo Trace. And I give them some other suggestions as well, but Buffalo Trace is always my top recommendation. Can you kind of just walk us through a brief history of the brand, of the distillery? I know you're not the historian, but just a brief synopsis of the history of the brand.
Yeah, that could go on a long time, but I'll not talk about every year from the start, but I will mention a few things. So first of all, Kentucky became a state in 1792, the 15th state. Where the distillery sits today, there was a stone warehouse built in 1811, and it housed a bunch of stuff, including some whiskey barrels from some neighboring distilleries. I'm not quite sure who those distilleries were, but the distillery first on this site was built in 1858. To put that in perspective, the Civil War ended in 1865. So flashing forward a little bit, 1870, I think most whiskey drinkers are familiar with E.H. Taylor. By the way, he was a fascinating individual. But anyways, he purchased that distillery in 1870, tore it down in 1872, and built a new distillery. And, he is considered to be the godfather, I think, of modern bourbon. And just to put that in perspective, a couple things he did was he created steamed warehouses, which were totally unheard of by then. And we still use them at Buffalo Trace today. And I'm pretty sure we're the only ones that use steam heated warehouses. So we make sure they don't dip too low, so we stay a little bit warm in the winter. And that's actually one of the reasons, in my opinion, why our whiskey really tastes as good and as smooth as it does. Another famous name in the Buffalo Trace arsenal is George T. Stagg. He actually bought the distillery from E.H. Taylor, who ran into some financial problems in about, it was the early or late 1870s. Couple of the warehouses we have on site today were built in 1881. And they're still there. Actually, I take it back. Warehouse A and B are no longer there, but Warehouse C, which was built in 1885, is still standing. And then Taylor's distillery burnt to the ground in 1882, rebuilt in 1883. By the way, I was out of whack a little bit. 1886 is when we started doing steam warehouses. So
I was about to correct you.
Yeah, were you? I'd be impressed by that. A couple other famous names are always worth mentioning, but Albert Blanton joined the distillery in 1897 as just an office worker. And in 1904, it was renamed the George T. Stagg Distillery. 1919 was 18th Amendment, otherwise known as Prohibition. And Albert Blanton became the president of the distillery in 1921. Now, one of the cool things is during Prohibition, Buffalo Trace was one of a few distilleries to get a permit to bottle medicinal whiskey. And that's a whole history topic all by itself, which is really quite fascinating. I think there were only 6 or 7 distilleries that had this license, but you'd see prescriptions that said drink 2 wine glasses of whiskey a day, things like that. So no real volume, but just sort of these general measurements. In 1942, the 1 millionth barrel was produced. And to put that in perspective, in 2022 is when we filled our 8 millionth barrel. And because we've expanded, we're going to fill about 1 million barrels now every 2 years. So it's just absolutely mind-boggling. Blanton's whiskey, the first single barrel ever, was released in 1984. And Sazerac bought the distillery, came back to a family-owned business in 1992. Harlan Wheatley, my boss, who became the master distiller of Buffalo Trace, was in 2005. So that's the bulk of it. I know that was very sort of bullet point, not a lot of flair and grace. I don't know if y'all have had the chance to talk to Freddie Johnson. He's one of our famous tour guides. Of course, he would have told you what I told you, but it would have taken an hour and a half. But there would have been incredible, romanticism and flair. I was just sort of very much to the point. But that's kind of I think some of the highlights of the history. We were named a historic national landmark in 2013. And as a result, we have to preserve the property as best we can. And there are certain things we're just not allowed to do to maintain historic landmark status. So we can't put up fake bricks or, things of that nature. It really, truly is maintained as a historic landmark.
So I'm curious. There's probably been a lot of books written about the history of whiskey that include Buffalo Trace. When's the movie coming out?
Well, don't know. But I'm
got to be working on something behind the scenes.
Somebody might be, but that, I get a glimpse into what marketing does, but not sure about movies. There's a lot of videos out there, a lot of YouTube things. All
right. So who plays Harlan Wheatley in the movie?
I think Harlan's going to have to play himself, but I'm going to guess he's not on this, but I'm also going to guess he's probably not a great actor, which is fine, because if he's playing himself, he just has to play himself.
That's true. That's true. And you're gonna cast George Clooney for your part, I take it?
Absolutely. A younger George Clooney, let's say. How about that?
Oh, nice. So obviously we were talking about both Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. I know Buffalo Trace being the flagship, but I think Eagle Rare would arguably be in that same conversation as one of your guys' flagship whiskeys. Can you talk about the difference between the two? And I know you guys don't release your mash bills, but how the mash bills differ from both the brands, if they do at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's actually a really good topic. First of all, Buffalo Trace came out, the brand, in 1999, and Eagle Rare was first introduced in the mid 70s. I think it was 74, 75. It was different company's name, and brands are bought and sold, but that's sort of the origins of those two. But when we talk about whiskey and bourbon in particular, remember bourbon, well, I'll talk about this afterwards, but bourbon has to be, there are 5 pretty stringent rules in place. One of them is it has to be 51% or more corn. And And yes, you're right. We don't talk about our grain bills. Personally, I don't think it would be a problem because if we told people our grain bills, they could not do what we do. There are many, many other factors. But as a very private company, that's just how we operate. But the grain bills that we typically use at the distillery are what's called BT1, Buffalo Trace 1. And that is a low rye grain bill. I mean, it's got a small percentage of rye. Rye is very spicy and peppery and floral, and it can be fruity, but it's got a lot of complexity. And we have BT2, which is a grain bill that's used for most notably Blanton's. And then we have our wheated bourbon, which has no rye, but a lot of wheat. And that's where Weller and Pappy comes from. And then we have a rye whiskey, which has to be at least 51% rye. So, very important to note that Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare are both the same grain bill, but they are quite different. So we cook them, we ferment them, and we distill them the same way. But then what we do is we put them in a barrel, and how long they age is the biggest factor. How long they age and where in the warehouse they age. So Buffalo Trace is at least 7.5 years old, typically runs 8. Eagle Rare is age dated at 10 years, so it is at least 10 years old. So it has at least 2 more years of age in it. And that's a pretty dramatic difference because during that time, you get a little bit more oak extraction, but as a barrel evaporates, what we call the angel's share, you lose volume. And then that's displaced with air, which has oxygen in it. Oxygen reacts with components in the whiskey to produce really kind of amazing, complex flavors like aged stone fruits, apricots, cherries, coconut, all sorts of stuff happen as a result of oxidation in time. Now, also, Buffalo Trace tends to be aged a little bit higher in the warehouse, a little warmer, so it matures a little bit differently. Products that are aged a little longer, we slow them down a little bit, so they tend to be a little bit lower in the warehouse. So same grain bill, but the flavor differences really are dramatic. Buffalo Trace, and I've got samples too, but unfortunately not your single barrels. But my Buffalo Trace, and it's going to be pretty consistent. There'll be some variation, certainly. It's a very natural process. It's got a lot of caramel. It's got a little bit of oak, a little bit of smokiness, a little bit of fruity character. And the Eagle Rare, to me, this Eagle Rare is quite a bit more oaky. It's got more of a aged stone fruit. The best way I like to describe that is, picture, most people have had raisins and they've had grapes. Well, they're the same thing, but one has been dried. And in the process of drying it, you concentrate flavors and you change flavors. When things oxidize, they get a little bit more sort of sweet and complex. So I get a lot of this out of my Eagle Rare. My Eagle Rare is actually really quite wonderful.
Now, are you tasting regular Eagle Rare, or are you tasting a single barrel from somebody else? It's regular Eagle Rare?
It's our standard Eagle Rare, yeah.
So obviously what you're tasting is going to be different than what our members tasting. Can you, I think we've covered this quite a bit, but maybe some new people here. Can you talk about like the main differences between a bottle you buy, like a bottle of Eagle Rare you buy off the shelf, and a bottle of Eagle Rare that maybe one of our members had that's a single barrel? What are the main differences?
Yeah. It's actually a really good question. In fact, I did a single barrel with a group yesterday, and that's rare. I don't do many single barrel tastings, but this was a really special group, friends of one of our tour guides. But so when I talk about flavor, we can talk about profile, like our target profile versus a preference. And the way I define that, picture a big globe, and in the dead center is our target. So one direction may be a little bit too much or a little bit oakier. One direction may be more malty. One direction may be more fruity. But we're looking for
One Direction is a band with Harry Styles.
Yeah, of course. But we're looking for a target that's going to be in the center of that. Now, when we pick single barrel, or when people pick single barrels, we may have more deviation. It may be a little bit more oaky. It may be a little bit more fruity. It would be something that we would not want to release as our blended batch, but it's still within profile, but it might be different. And that's the beauty of single barrels, is that they can be different in ways you would not normally see. I don't see many Eagle Rare single barrels. Kentucky, believe it or not, Kentucky is about the worst place in the country to buy whiskey, because people come here to taste whiskey and it just flies off the shelves. But whenever I see an Eagle Rare single barrel or a Buffalo Trace single barrel, I'll buy it just to see. And it's not very often. But again, you're going to see differences. And that's the beauty single barrels, because people get to pick what they like the best. It might not match our profile exactly, but it is something, there's something in there that they like and prefer. And that's really the fun of picking single barrels.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get into it when we get to our tasting portion, but I think, as often as I can, I really like to select the single barrels myself, whether it's through vendors, distilleries mailing me samples to choose from, or if myself going to the distillery and picking, which I've done at Buffalo Trace before. These picks were a distiller's choice. I think it happened early in the year, and I was in Miami, and I doing a restaurant opening. I couldn't get samples. Anyways, so these were distiller's choice, and I think that I obviously pick to my preference a lot of time, but we've done a lot of Eagle Rare barrel picks, and I'll get to it in a minute, but I have barrel 040. And if you follow me on Instagram, I posted this a few weeks ago. This barrel, I didn't get to taste all the barrels because they were distiller's choice, but this specific one, in my opinion, is the best Eagle Rare barrel pick that I've had. My choices, bottles I bought off the shelf, and so distiller's choice. Kudos to if it was Harlan or if it was you or whoever picked this, but maybe it was just random. But I'll get into why I love this so much in a little bit in tasting notes. But single barrels can vary so greatly, and regular Eagle Rare is amazing. And if you do like your single barrel pick, every restaurant did get a little bit extra. So I believe we do have more bottles of the Eagle Rare. We don't have extra bottles of the Buffalo Trace barrel pick, but we do have extra bottles of the Eagle Rare for sale. I think they're $50 each. If you want to buy an extra bottle, if you liked yours and you want to buy an extra one.
It's a bargain. It's a good price.
Yeah. So, I kind of want to, I know you're not the history guy, but I do want to kind of maybe get into a little bit of history. So at one point, Eagle Rare was bottled at 101 proof, from what I've researched. From what I've read, is that it was released as kind of a direct competition to Wild Turkey. Is that accurate?
I believe so. 101, Wild Turkey were, I think, probably the first to do that. And it's, I don't know. I think, there's a sweet spot in terms of whiskey flavor. And, I'm deviating a little bit, but even when I buy or taste barrel strength whiskeys, I like to dilute, and I find 105 to 110 is really the sweet spot. I really, truly do. There's a reason why more flavor is generated at those levels, but it could have been.
And why is that?
So first of all, comparing super strong whiskey to some that's diluted. First of all, when we taste, we'll always taste at the bottle proof, but when we taste as a matter of routine, we taste at 40 proof or 20% alcohol. And although it's not as enjoyable, you can learn a lot more about the whiskey. But comparing 140 proof to 105 proof, the best analogy I give, and I give stupid little analogies like this.
Oh, me too.
Is picture, and not that I ever played water polo, but picture water polo. Under the water, they're fighting and scratching and grabbing each other, but you can't see it. So there's interactions, there's collisions. Well, if you were to separate them, move them apart, or dilute these molecules, they are more free to move. And they actually will become more volatile, and you could separate them better when you taste them. There's these things called surfactants, and when they're a little bit more diluted, they just become more volatile and then more present to taste. So it's a preference. If it's too diluted, to me, it doesn't have the full mouth coating, silky textures, but if it's too strong, it gets hot and it hurts. To me, 105 is generally the sweet spot. Now, I think
it hurts, but then in about 30 to 45 minutes, it hurts less.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably true. But to answer your question, I'm going to guess this is outside of my lane, but I think there has been a strong preference to be more approachable, and lower proof is a little bit more approachable. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And to be frank, first of all, whiskey has to be at least 80 proof. That's one of the rules and laws of whiskey. So 90 proof is quite a bit more concentrated than 80 proof, and you could taste the difference. And it just was determined to be the sweet spot. And, we can sell more bottles at 90 proof than we can at 100 proof. Now, I don't know if that was a factor when this was done, but, that's a reality. But I think it has more to do with consumer preferences than anything else.
Well, if I can put in a formal request, I know you guys are bringing back a lot of brands, and historical brands were released recently, I pay a little bit more for a 101 proof Eagle Rare, kind of a retro release, but.
Well, this is teasing, but Eagle Rare 17 is 101 proof.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. But I want a 10-year 101 proof. I don't want to break the bank.
Yeah, I hear you.
The Eagle Rare has been not always under the Buffalo Trace catalog. It was, I believe it was owned by Heaven Hill at one point. Do you know if the mash bills always stayed the same? I know you don't release your mash bills, but was it the same mash bill when it was at Heaven Hill versus when it was purchased in the early 90s?
So you may actually know more about this than me, but I think at 1.2 it was Seagram's.
Okay.
I think. Our evidence suggests it was the same mash bill, but
which is what?
Depending on, what's that? Which is, well, it's at least 51% corn. Yeah. At least 51% corn. And malted barley and a little bit of rye.
Got it. We're going to get into tasting here in a second, but what is your opinion on, a lot of whiskeys get their 15 minutes of fame, right? You get, best whiskey in the world. They win awards. They kind of get hot for a year, maybe less. But like Buffalo Trace bourbon has been it has legs. Like it's been around forever. It's well, not forever, but you said 99. It consistently, you talk to whiskey drinkers and they say, oh, Buffalo Trace is my go-to. Like that's the whiskey. It's consistent. It's just, and it's constantly talked about amongst whiskey drinkers of just a solid bourbon. There's some other brands thrown in the row, but I think Buffalo Trace is near the top of the list. Like, what do you think it is about Buffalo Trace, the Buffalo Trace whiskey specifically, that that gives it its legs, that gives it its stamina to still be considered after all these years? I think the whiskey boom, if you want to say it, was late 2000s, early 2010s, kind of somewhere around there, and obviously it's only grown bigger and bigger every year. Like, what makes Buffalo Trace so special in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, and without being too cliche, there's a saying at Buffalo Trace to honor tradition and embrace change. And one thing that we don't deviate from is the recipe, and it's funny because as a person with a scientific background, if we have a problem, I like to experiment, to say, hey, what if we did this? What if we did that? Well, I have stopped requesting certain experiments because, Heartland is rigorous on honoring tradition. And if anything is going to hurt flavor, and this is maybe a silly example, we will not do it. But I think there's a lot of factors that make our whiskey special. We've been doing it a long time, and we have learned what works. When you're making a product that's 8 years old, it's hard. You make one and then you change it radically, and then you're going to be bad for 8 years, for example. So we have learned how to make good whiskey. We also do some things that are pretty unique. The way we cook our grain is unique. Not many people do it. Our warehouses where we are heated in the winter, so we don't let them get too cold, has a very important impact on the flavor. And I am not aware of anybody else at any size, any type of scale that does that. But the longer I've been here, the more I realize that that's actually kind of a really big deal. When we put in our new still, we recently expanded. There are probably some things from a design standpoint and an operation standpoint that we would change, but we duplicated the still in every way, because there are things in our industry that we know if we do this, this will be the flavor. And there's a lot of science involved, but I will be very transparent to tell you that we don't understand all of it. So rather than take a chance, we will design the still the same way. We will design the fermenters the same way, the process the same way, because we like the whiskey we make. That may be dull, it may be boring, but it produces whiskey that really, to your point, has stood the test of time. Now, the other thing is we have a lot of whiskey in-house. I know there are shortages out there because it takes so long to make it, but we have a lot of whiskey in-house. So we've got a lot of blending opportunities that help us achieve that flavor profile. So, and by the way, I mentioned that we honor tradition, embrace change. I wish I could talk to this group about the thousands of experiments that we have ongoing. But we do a couple meetings a year, and we remind everybody every time we do these meetings that we are not allowed to talk about it even internally. We cannot talk about it with our employees. Certainly people are involved, they are aware, but it's very, very hush hush until we have a new release or until we have a failed experiment and we don't release it. So we learn on a regular basis by doing experiments, and that helps us with our regular production, and it also helps us with new brands. Just a very slow process.
And then before we get into, if you were to pinpoint one, what you think is the most important thing about making a quality whiskey and making it consistently, what would that be?
The fermentation. So, without getting into all the technical details, we mill grain and then we cook it, and that's where we convert starch into sugar, because yeast cannot eat starch, yeast eats sugar. And they produce mostly two things. They produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. We don't use the carbon dioxide in distillation process, and it's about, for every pound of sugar, we produce about a half a pound of alcohol and about a half a pound of carbon dioxide. But the most important part, in my opinion, is we produce 350 to 400 different compounds that are so small, they're really impossible to measure. But these are the things we call congeners, they're aromas, they're flavors, and that provides the complexity of a really good whiskey. And most important to me is that as the whiskey ages, those are some of the things that turn into really incredible, wonderful flavors. There's always a debate, what's the most important part of the process? Well, what spoke of the wheel do you prioritize? And if I were to pick top two, I'd say fermentation and then the aging conditions, temperature, humidity, time. Those are the things that are most important, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's get into tasting. As always, in the comment section, please feel free to say the barrel you're tasting, your tasting notes. I have some generic tasting notes here, and I'm going to give you my tasting notes on the barrels that I'm drinking. So let's start with Buffalo Trace. I'm drinking in 307. Let's see here if you can. Barrel 307. And then Eagle Rare, I'm drinking 040, which I think I said already. But so Buffalo Trace on my barrel, again, please share your comments and your tasting notes, but pretty consistent, beautiful notes of vanilla and toffee and caramel on the nose. I get a little bit of mint, like if you just slap some mint in your hand, a little bit of anise on the nose. Yeah, and the nose, the palate really follows the nose here. I love the one thing I do love about Buffalo Trace, and I've said this in the past, is that I feel like the finish is, it's like medium long to me, and even for a 90 proof whiskey, I feel like it lingers around quite a bit. I get like this kind of dry, oaky characteristic lingering on my palate. but I get that fresh kind of like mint thing that lingers on as well. On the palate, I do get a little like stone fruit, whether it be prune or fig or raisin, kind of mid palate, which I think is really nice. Let me see if anybody else is drinking this one. Any notes? Anything to add, Danny, on like typical Buffalo Trace? I know you're not tasting a single barrel, but
Yeah. No, I think your comments are absolutely within range. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And the one that I'm tasting, which is a batch bourbon, I'm not actually sure how long ago it was bottled, but certainly a little vanilla, a little bit of toffee, a little bit of a grainy character. As the older the bourbon gets, it's sort of a spectrum. The way whiskey tastes, it's a spectrum. When it's very, very young, you get a lot of grain, a lot of fermentation, a lot of hot alcohols, and then they slowly change. Some of them are masked by other compounds, and so there's an evolution. And it's really nice in the toffee and the vanilla. My whiskey, it's actually, mine's a little fruitier than normal. Fruit comes from the fermentation. Our yeast is not intensely fruity, so this stands out as being just a little bit maybe different, but super, super nice, really smooth. When I taste whiskey, by the way, a couple tips. I sniff it with my mouth open just a little bit, and that helps force air into your olfactory cavity so you can sniff it better. And then I'll do aroma, 20 sniffs for every sip typically. And then flavor, what are the flavors that I'm experiencing? And then the finish, which speaks to how long do those flavors last? Is there a tactile feeling? Is it astringent? Is it hot from alcohol? Is it creamy from some fermentation characters? So that's how I evaluate whiskey every single time: aroma, flavor, and finish. And when you start getting in the habit of doing it the same way every time, you remove how you taste things as a variable, and it really makes a difference.
Yeah, I think everyone has their own tactics. I mean, I did a tasting recently in one of our restaurants, and my typical way of nosing first is I do alternate nostrils, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then I learned this from Freddie actually, is that your body has a dominant nostril and it alternates every few hours. Now I don't know if that's just a Freddie tall tale, but I feel like it's true for me. And then I'll usually just put my nose straight in, and I'm always short. You always want to do short sniffs. You never want to like deeply inhale. And then I always smell top of the glass, middle of the glass, bottom of the glass. Again, different things work for everyone. That's what I've learned works for me, kind of to get everything. But I think your nosing the whiskey is definitely really, really important.
And then two things I'd like to add. So when you look at a glass, and if you tilt it a lot, you get much more surface area, so more stuff becomes volatile. But the other thing that's really cool is after you're done drinking a whiskey and you let the glass sit there for a while, that little tiny drop that remains, the alcohol will go away, and you'll get a whole different concentration of aromas. So that's when your glass is empty, let it sit for a half hour and sniff it. And it's really an interesting experience what happens.
Nice. This specific Eagle Rare, like I said, this is one of my favorite, or it is my favorite Eagle Rare pick I've ever had. And this is Barrel 040. My notes here are cacao. I actually get a lot of baking spices.
In case people see my hand keep bumping up, my dog is telling me it's time to do stuff. So,
what kind of dog is it? A spaniel?
No, it's a Aussie, Australian
Shepherd. Oh, Shepherd. Nice. Boy, girl?
Girl.
What's her name?
Maggie. Magnolia, and we call her Maggie. We name our dogs after trees. The other one's Juniper. We call her Junie.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. Yeah, but on this one, I get a really nice note of like nutmeg and cinnamon on the nose. I think like there's some nice cacao here, candy orange. And on the palate, like I got not like Amburana cinnamon toast crunch. Like you hear a lot of like Amburana finishes. Everyone's like, oh, cinnamon toast crunch, cinnamon toast crunch. Like this to me is like very subtle, but I still get like the breadiness, but also cinnamon. I get a little bit of like sweet tea, which I find really nice. And I don't know, I really like it. I opened it and I cracked it, and I was just like, this is awesome. I didn't pick this one. This was a distiller's pick, but kudos to ever pick this one. So we'll move on. We're going to do song choices really quick, and then we'll move on to Q&A from our audience. So as always, you can follow our playlist on Shopify. That's where you pay for your whiskey club. Spotify is where you can find our playlist, Eureka Whiskey Club. We add some songs every month, and I believe, I think we're up to like 40 something songs. So Danny, do you want to tell us about your song choices? I have them written down if you don't remember what you picked, so no pressure.
Yeah, no, I do remember. In an age of alcohol production as a professional, I sort of hesitated because it maybe doesn't necessarily speak to responsibility and moderation. But the song I picked was Hank Williams Jr., Whiskey Bent and Hellbound.
I love it.
And it's a great song. I mean, I just think he's, in the good times, and it's got a good jingle, but please do not drink and drive. That is I'm in all seriousness, that is a big deal.
Oh, no, for sure. Yes.
And for
Uber and Lyft, they all exist for reasons. Come on.
Yeah. But Whiskey Bent and Hellbound is a great song. I didn't listen to all the lyrics. I don't know if it's always politically correct, but it's a rock and roll tune for sure. I think last time I did Whiskey River, Willie Nelson.
Nice.
One bourbon, one scotch, and one beer is always a good one too. Yeah, there's a lot of good whiskey songs for sure.
I think the other song you chose was Rock a Roll or Whiskey Rock a Roller by
Leonard Skinner. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's a good one too. But I was partial to Hank Williams Jr. this time around.
Well, I kind of took your lead on this one, and I don't always choose like songs that have whiskey in them, but like for these classic whiskeys, I felt like I needed to pick like some good songs that talked about whiskey. And my first song is Kentucky Straight by Johnny Cash, which I think is just a beautiful song that he wrote about his wife. And then my second choice is probably the most on the nose song I've ever chosen for these picks, and that's Bourbon in Kentucky by Dierks Bentley. Yeah. So 4 good songs, all about whiskey, to enjoy some Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. And we're going to get into our Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to jump out of frame or partially out of frame to look at these questions really quick. Roll through here. One moment. Matthew Archer asks, have the distillery grounds experienced any sinkholes due to this is like a very engineer question, to the karst terrain eroding limestone bedrock? If so, any impacts to any warehouses?
No, we have not. We've had situations where water pipes have broken and eroded the earth by the time we shut it off and fixed it. But no, speaking for us, we have not had sinkholes. There's an incredible network of caves in Kentucky, and that's part of the water filterability thing. But no, we've not had any natural sinkholes that have caused us problems.
Clark White asks, what is your favorite whiskey tasting note? It's like choosing your favorite child, or your favorite dog. And how do you think that flavor is achieved?
Okay. So first of all, people often ask what my favorite whiskey is, and I say it's like, which one of my children do I love the most? But I add to that, I have an answer. I will never share it. And that's actually not true. You love them for different reasons. Same thing with the dog. So that's kind of mean. But anyways, yeah, actually, I've got a really clear answer on my favorite whiskey note. I don't have a clear answer on my favorite whiskey, but there's a compound called a lactone. And there are, in the chemistry world, there are 2 versions of it. They're like stereo. They look the same in the mirror, but then when you turn them this way, they're different orientations. It's called a stereoisomer. But my favorite one is, I forget if it's the chemistry world uses cis and trans. I think the cis lactone. I don't recall for sure, but it tastes like, or it smells mostly like toasted coconut. And we know that it comes from the oak. And when you talk about oak, there are 4 compounds in oak, very, very, very generally speaking. There's cellulose, which just provides structure. And then there's hemicellulose, which when we toast it, that's where you get butterscotch and toffee flavors and a little bit of the sweetness. The sugar is extracted from there. And then you've got the lignans, which are baking spices and vanilla. And the lactone comes out of that group. And then you have tannins, which are mouthfeel, bitter, astringent. So that's the very, very high level summary of oak flavors. But a lactone comes from the oak. But the interesting thing is, we don't see it until it generally gets to 9 or 10 years old. And we don't understand why. There's something there we just don't understand yet. So, but I know it when I see it. Whenever I smell lactone, I'm dialed in, and there can be nothing wrong with that whiskey once I get a lactone. And it doesn't happen all the time. It happens on occasion with our 8-year-old products. I see it a lot in Eagle Rare. I see it a ton in our ultra age stuff, but it's just special. And toasted coconut is the best way to describe it.
So the next time someone tells me a 6-year-old whiskey tastes like coconut, I'm going to slap them across the face and say, "You're wrong. Danny told me so."
Do it twice. Do it once for me also. No, but truth be told, I suppose it could happen. But the fact of the matter is, we don't understand it. You know, it's funny when distillers talk about art. I think what that means is they don't know, and that's okay. You know, because we don't understand everything. But it's kind of like when I got a problem with my computer, I call it a glitch. It means I don't know what happened. So it's often the case when somebody calls it art, it means they don't know, and that's okay. But we just don't know everything.
Perfect segue into the next question, because I don't know what the hell this means. Mark Horowitz asks, does anybody still use a handheld refractometer to measure ETOH amounts?
Yeah, refractometer. So ETOH is alcohol. You know, we use...
Is it like a gravity, like when you're brewing beer, like you're measuring gravity?
And how the light refracts through it is a function of, you know, what's in it. So, you know, alcohol is indirectly measured with a refractometer. You more directly measure sugar. But we do use handheld refractometers for quick, rough estimates. You know, we don't use it for the real precise stuff, but yeah, we still use them all the time.
Cool. All right, Nicholas DeMuth asks, can you share a career highlight that really stood out to you and why?
Wow, there's a lot of them. You know, I'll do 2. One of them has to do with people, you know, because, you know, I work with a lot of people, and you know, and I often can tell people I don't make whiskey. I manage people who make whiskey, you know, and to some degree that's true, especially in my current role where I'm sort of in a corporate job. I don't have specific ownership, but in my last facility, I made a lot of, without getting too long-winded, because it would be a long story, I made a lot of changes to responsibilities, and you know, it freed up supervision. You know, we have workers and supervisors and different levels of management. It freed up supervision to be more project focused. But in the result of doing that, a whole bunch of duties had to be given to the people doing the jobs. And, you know, it's funny because initially people think, oh my God, that's so much more work. What am I going to do? But really what it turned out to be was more meaningful work. And they just became more empowered and more engaged, and they did a better job and they liked their jobs more. So it was a really big win. There were things that came out of that were far more spectacular than I envisioned. So it was really an example that speaks to when you give people responsibility, and you know they make mistakes. And I think one of the fears was, oh my God, if I make a mistake, I'm going to get in trouble. Well, you know, the only people that don't make mistakes are the ones that don't do anything. So making a mistake is really not a problem. if it's the same thing over and over again, or gross negligence, or violent, or malicious, those are different things. But mistakes happen. God, I can't even tell you how many mistakes I made today. So anyway, so that was the people one.
I think that's a great. I mean, not to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you. I just think that's a great leadership mindset. Like, I'm gonna take that. Like, that's like, if you don't make mistakes, that means you're not doing anything. That's like, that really resonates with me. So that's really cool. Thanks, Danny.
I mean, truly, I really believe the only people that don't make mistakes are the ones that don't do anything.
No,
And,
that's so powerful.
You want to not have bad mistakes where people get hurt or have huge losses. But when you make a mistake, you learn from it, and you help make things better, and you share it, and you implement procedures and share with other people, which is hard, by the way. That was one of the learnings, is that people were embarrassed, but rather than in a long ago, it was a discipline rich environment, and I just abolished that. And people had to share and say, hey, here's what happened, here's what we're going to do to prevent it. And that was hard for people. I didn't realize how hard that was, but it had really positive impacts long term. So on the technical side, and this one gets also really complicated, but it involves science and chemistry. And when we cook grain, enzymes break starch into sugar. Anyways, we had a grain change, and long story short, I actually had to dig into my theoretical knowledge of how calcium works and how calcium stabilizes enzymes, which break starch down into sugar. And by doing some experiments, we were able to have radically improved efficiencies and yields and flavor production. So that's a really complicated one to explain, but it involves water chemistry and cooking and mashing, where we convert starch into sugar. But it was a really bizarre situation. And just based on my education, I remembered some things and did some tests and was able to prove it out. And it was a hugely impactful change. So that was pretty cool. I know that doesn't explain to your audience a whole lot, but it was a big one.
It was meaningful for you, so that's all that matters.
Yeah, right.
Let me see here. So Christy Cardana asks, how do you transfer from one barrel to the next barrel? Is there a bottle or two in the middle where it's actually a blend of two barrels, or is there a partial fill which gets moved to a different bottle blend of bourbon?
So I assume we're talking about single barrels, and we must be, because when we don't do single barrels, we may dump 20 or 80 barrels at a time and create a blend and taste it. So single barrels, it is absolutely 100% single barrel. So what we do is we dump the barrel into a little tank. Remember, when a barrel is totally full, it's about, it's exactly 53 gallons. And when we dump it, depending on how old it is, it might be 35 gallons. So we dump it into a little tank. We process it the way we normally do, meaning filter out the char. We add water to cut it. And then we bottle that little tank. We bring that little tank that's on wheels to the line, and we empty that tank out. And when it's empty, we can't fill another bottle. There's little bottoms in the tank, but we'll just dump that back into our batch tank. So no, when we get a single barrel, it's absolutely one barrel, never anything else. Now, it could be, during the transition, you fill a case, you have the last three bottles of one barrel, and then the next 3 bottles of the next barrel. So I guess in theory, if you bought a case, you could get 2 different barrels, but every bottle will absolutely only have 1 barrel in it if it's a single barrel.
All right, we got time, I think, for 2 more questions here. So Marco Sanchez asked, you mentioned about heating up the warehouse so that the temps don't drop too low. What flavors arise when it gets too cold? What happens to the whiskey, I guess, right? So proteins cling together, right?
Sorry, say that again. What?
I don't know if it's different from the barrel versus the bottle, but when you have a lot of temperature fluctuation, especially in like non-chill filtered whiskeys, you actually get like protein particles that bind together, and you'll see like little floaties in the whiskey. That's not part of his question. That was just my observation. I don't know if the same thing happens in the barrel when it gets too cold, but are there certain flavors that are imparted when things get too cold?
Sure. But by the way, they're not proteins. They're things called free fatty acids. And when you get chill haze, those are the things that combine to form the snow globey look. Should not be any protein except for what might come out of the wood. But so traditional wisdom is that when it gets hot out, the whiskey in the barrel expands and goes into the wood. And when it gets cold, it gets pushed back out of the wood into the whiskey. So there's an exchange. But what we have learned is by maintaining more moderate temperature, we just get a smoother palate and a little bit more complexity without a lot of astringency and harshness. And that could have something to do with the tannins that are extracted. But we have learned that by less in and out of the wood, we actually get a softer profile. And it's interesting because we talk about whiskey age, but what we really should talk about is maturity. Because if I have a barrel, like for example, Saz 18 is 18-year-old Saz rye whiskey, and it's stored really low and really cold. If we stored that whiskey for 18 years up high in a hot warehouse, it would probably not be good at all. In fact, I know it would not be good. So it's a combination, and it gets really, really complicated because, you extract wood at some level, and then you lose volume, and you get these oxidative reactions at a slower rate. So with longer age, you get more of those. But anyways, back to the original question, we just feel that the profile is softer and rounder and just more balanced, less extremes. But we really like our whiskey when we moderate our warehouses and don't let them get too cold.
So I'd imagine that Sazerac 18, like you learned through trial and error that the barrels kept at a lower, closer to the floor in the warehouse had the certain flavor profile that you really enjoyed. And then moving forward, is that kind of like how that flavor profile was developed, knowing that we love the flavor profile of this mash bill in these barrels at this level, and then is all Sazerac 18 come from the same level, or are you blending different levels together?
So it doesn't all come from the same level, but generally lower levels.
Okay. And
whenever we create the blend for the BTACs, the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, the Saz 18, Eagle Rare 17, George C. Stagg, William LaRue Weller, or Thomas Handy, a panel approves those blends. So every barrel is checked before we create the blends, but they generally tend to be very low in the warehouse for sure. But yeah, I think over time we learn. We taste a lot of stuff, and we will taste young whiskey at various elevations, and we just start to learn patterns and make predictions, and it's a learning process, and it happens so slowly. You don't get a ton of data samples. Like when I used to work in beer, beer's done in anywhere from 10 days to 3 months. So it's a lot easier to learn about process.
So I have a personal question for you before we get into, I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll choose, go through the questions and choose the winners. So, I think secondary market is a issue, or a lot of whiskey drinkers will consider secondary market an issue. With recent releases of, you look at releases of Pappy Van Winkle, from an on and off premise perspective, our price has really much maintained the same, and gone up a little bit extra. But the difference between what liquor stores pay for Pappy Van Winkle and what either they sell it for, and this is something I think we do really well at Eureka, is we don't have huge markups, and we really try not to gouge our guests, and what I feel like we charge fair prices. But a lot of secondary market is obviously a lot different because they're turning bottles for much higher prices. A lot of the releases that Sazerac has done recently, like Weller Millennium and Eagle, Double Eagle Very Rare, like you see higher costs associated with those bottles. Is that in response to the secondary market, or what is is there? I know you don't work for the sales department. I was just curious if you could shed some light on that, because I know the secondary market is a big issue as far as the gap between what a liquor store or a restaurant pays for a product versus what you buy it for on secondary.
Yeah, and you know, and also we are not allowed to set price, so we can make a recommendation.
Yeah, of course.
BTAX, current SRP is 125, and it went up recently a little bit. But you know, if you see it in Kentucky, it's $1,500 a bottle, and that's 100% profit that goes to the retailer. So when we, you know, I cannot say if that specifically speaks to that. It wouldn't surprise me, but the issue is when we do some releases like Daniel Weller, which was really unique, and it was, you know, I think under $1,000, but the Double Eagle Very Rare, there are, you know, 1,000 bottles. I mean, there's very, very little of that whiskey. So I think it was an opportunity to help. You know, first of all, very, very little of it left. You know, it ages for 20 years. You know, we pay whatever, you know, $100 to put it in the barrel, and when you're done, you get, you know, 10% of that barrel. So, you know, if you were to actually look at the price of the whiskey, if you sold that whiskey when it was 8 years old and you had this much versus 20 years old and you had this much, you know, the profit difference is probably not that much because we just lose so much. So that's part of it. And I think that, you know, and I'm speaking for me personally, you know, when I see people buying whiskeys and flipping them on the secondary market, they're really not the fans of the bourbon. They're trying to make a profit. And I think that this will hopefully weed some of that out so that people that really want it get a chance to enjoy
No,
it.
I think it's really good, to be honest with you. I mean, my question was coming, like, I think it's a really good thing. And, you know, I buy whiskey to drink it. Like, I think a lot of our members feel the same way. And I think, you know, you guys are doing a really good thing with that. So I have one more question. I think it's a really good question from an audience member. I will shamelessly self-plug here some promotion. If you want to try Weller Millennium or Double Eagle Very Rare, we do have both of those bottles available at our Bakersfield location. And we do have some Daniel Weller available at our Claremont location.
You know, the Millennium's freaking unbelievable. And I was very fortunate.
I'll have to take your word for it. I can't even try it. And I'm the VP of beverage for the company. So
I got to weigh in on the blend, so I got a chance to try it.
Awesome. All right, last question. We'll choose some winners and I'll let you go. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Let's see here. Where was it? Gary Malberg asks, who from Buffalo Trace's history would you enjoy to have a glass of bourbon with and hearing stories from them?
Without a doubt, E.H. Taylor. Just because he was an innovator and he had incredible ideas, and he was the first one to put copper in distilling. He was a bit of a character. You know, we often paint pictures of how wonderful these people were. I'm not sure he was such a wonderful guy. He was the one, too, by the way, that created the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, which put really stringent rules, and it eliminated some of the bad things that people called rectifiers were doing. They were adding weird stuff to whiskey, and he changed that. So E.H. Taylor would be the guy. Yep, exactly. Yeah, he would be the guy.
That's awesome. All right, Danny, let's go roll through these questions. We'll choose a couple winners, and then we will let everyone go on their way. So we have the question about the terrain and the sinkholes. We had the question about your favorite tasting note. We had the question about the refractometers. We had the question about highlights of your career. Let's see here. We had the question about
the single barrel, one barrel per.
Yeah, we had the 1 or 2 barrel, the blends from Christy. We had the question, who'd you like to enjoy a bourbon with? And then we had the question about the heating up and the flavor profiles of it when the temperature gets too cold. So favorite 2 questions of the night, I'll choose first place and second place.
So would it be okay for me to say that you could just give a bottle to everybody that asks a question?
That's up to you. I mean, you'll have to handle the shipping logistics. We're not giving any bottles away for my understanding, but you'd have to talk to Candida about that.
That's coming from our end. Okay, all right.
Yeah. Sorry.
They're all good questions, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to go with the career highlight question, just because brought back some good memories. You know, our work is very hard, but sometimes there are cool things that happen. And both of those that I didn't explain very well were pretty cool. So I'm going to go with the career highlights. And the next one, well, shoot, I got, again, a lot of good questions. I'm going to weigh it down to one or two. I'm going to go with my favorite flavor compound, because I almost always, that's the lactone, the favorite flavor, because I almost always mention that when I talk about what I like about whiskey, but this time somebody prompted me specifically to answer that question. So I like that one as well. A lot of good questions. They're all good questions. So
yes, and thank you very much for the members that always join live. I know we always see a lot of familiar names in the comment section. So thank you everyone for being a member. Again, we got a lot of exciting releases coming up, both in your subscription bags and also some special releases. I'm going to go with, I really loved the career highlight just because of the answer that you gave about if you don't make mistakes, that means you don't care, you're not trying, and that really resonated with me. So I'm going to give it to Nicholas Demuth, first place prize for that swag package, and then Clark White, great question about the favorite tasting note. You're going to get that second place prize. So thank you everyone. Really appreciate everyone from the bottom of my heart from being a member. Love doing this every month. It's really like the highlight of my month. And have a good night. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we'll hopefully see you again.
Yeah, and I enjoyed it. I always enjoy this group. So thank you for setting it all up.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.